And so God's rights result in obligation for man. Man's obligation results in rights for man. And then man's rights and obligations result in sovereign spheres. That would be the next step in our logic. Man's rights result in sovereign spheres. We've talked about sphere sovereignty. It's the concept that there are these orders, these spheres, these organizations, these human groupings in particular of peoples. And those groupings and those organizations are pre-political. They exist before the government ever came into play. They're created by God. They're defined by God. They're given their authority from God for purposes explained by God. And the state has nothing to do with these spheres. Nothing to do with their existence. Nothing to do with their purpose. Nothing to do with their authority structure. These spheres are all pre-political. Let me flesh that out a little more, and we'll get to that in coming weeks. But you've already turned, I think, to Genesis chapter 1. And let's consider Genesis chapter 1 and what we've already been considering for weeks past. Chapter 1, verse 28, we have the cultural mandate or the creation mandate. Chapter 1, verse 28, having made man and woman in his image, and that's key. We know that man was made in the image and likeness of God. In 28, God blessed them, and he said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth. We've talked in previous weeks, this is the cultural mandate or the creation mandate. And what you see here is that God commands man to do certain things. God has that right. And man is now under obligation to do these things. And that obligation that man has now produces in man a right. Man has a right to marriage. And man has a right to children. Now, in God's good purposes, he may not have every person be married. He may not have every person have children. But man has the right to marriage, and man has the right to children because God commands this very thing. And to push it a little further, man has the right to 3 or more children. Follow the logic, it's very simple here. If a man and a woman come together and they have one child, when those two individuals die, they have depleted the population by 1. There were 2, and they leave behind 1. You cannot fill the earth by having only 1 child. You cannot fill the earth by having only 2 children. Now, God in his good providence may have you only have 1 or have 2 children, but it will require a minimum of 3 children per couple to carry out the cultural mandate. You cannot fill the earth unless you leave behind more children than you started with. You start off with you and your spouse, and there's 2 of you, and if you leave behind only 2 children, you will never fill the earth. Basic mathematics. And so no government can come along and say, no, you can only have 1 child, as China has done. Or you can only have 2 children. No, man has the right to 3 or more children. And that creates then the family. The family is a sphere. The family is a sovereign sphere. It is created by God. Its existence is from God. Its purpose is from God. Its definition is from God. Its authority structure is from God. It's not created by the state. It's not defined by the state. It's not ruled by the state. It is a pre-political institution, separate from and not subservient to the state. It is its own autonomous entity created by and for God. And it is the result, it is the outworking of man's human rights. Biblical human rights are that man has the right to marriage and family, including 3 or more children. And that's all the outworking of God's rights to be obeyed and worshiped. So man has this right to a family, and that family creates a sphere. And when we talk about the sphere being separate from the state and apart from the state and preceding the state, that brings a question. Well, how do these spheres relate? How does the sphere of the state, which is another God-ordained sphere, how does it interact with the sphere of the family? And to make it more complex, anytime you have a family, within that sphere, there are individual spheres, because each individual person comprises their own sphere. They have the right to their own life, and they have the right to worship God, to obey God. And so the family sphere cannot override the individual's right to worship God and obey. And then you add in the third sphere of the state. And the question is, well, how do these spheres interact with one another? What do we do with the fact that they do interlock and overlap at times? That's the million-dollar question that we're not going to answer today. But we will. We will. But it's kind of like a math equation. We haven't developed the easier equations. We haven't developed the easier answers yet. We need to do that. We need to start with the easier establishing of the spheres and the purpose of the spheres and the source of the spheres so that we can then talk about how they interact with one another. So the fact of the matter is, yes, man has rights. And yes, there are sovereign spheres, and those rights and spheres come from God, and they may not be infringed upon. And yes, we love our unbelieving neighbor, such that when we see those rights being trampled on, we defend them and their rights. When the state attempts to trample them, we speak up for our unbelieving neighbor, because we love our neighbor as ourselves. And yes, we love our brothers and sisters in Christ. Jesus instructed us to love one another as I have loved you. We love our neighbor the way we love ourselves. We love other Christians the way Christ has loved us. And so as we look on at our brothers and sisters in Christ, and when we see the state trying to take away God's right to be worshiped and obeyed, when we see the state trying to denigrate the means of grace given by God to produce Christ in us, we know the means of grace, the gathering of the saints, the preaching of the word, the fellowship, the communion that we're going to celebrate today. These are the ordinary means of grace that God uses in us to produce Christ in us. And when we see that the state is trying to take away those means of grace, which are a right that we have, we speak up. We speak up. We say, no, Caesar, president, governor, you may not take away those rights. You have no authority to take away those rights. God requires we obey him. Whether it's right in your eyes to obey God or man, we'll leave that to you, but we can't help but do what we're supposed to do. So yes, we stand up for our neighbor. And yes, we stand up for our brothers and sisters in Christ when we see their rights infringed upon. But if those are our only concerns, if those are our primary goals, then we are nothing more than humanists in Christian garb. If the rights of our neighbors and the rights of our brothers and sisters are what drives us, then we're nothing more than idolaters calling ourselves Christians. Why? Why do I say that? Because we've simply inverted the first and second greatest commandment. God's called us to love him supremely, called us to love him first and foremost with all of our heart, all of our mind, all of our soul, and all of our strength. So to be consumed with the rights of my neighbor and brother is nothing more than idolatry, if I'm not first loving God and his rights, standing up for God's rights. Our driving motivation, our chief concern must be God's glory, not mine, not my neighbor's. We have to be those who first and foremost stand for God and for his rights. We are his ambassadors. We are his representatives, and it is his lordship that we proclaim, not ours. We have to love God and serve God with all of our heart and mind and soul and strength and represent God. And only then do we love our neighbor as ourself and our brother the way Christ has loved us.